All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. This has been a handful of weeks or maybe even months in the making, but I'm super excited that finally we've been able to get the one and only Micah Dank with the one and only Dan Winter together for an incredible conversation. I know that we were going to start with just a bit of a free form chat. I know, Micah, you had some questions, and then we would go into a little bit of a presentation in the astrotheological realm, and then we'll probably wrap it up from there. But first and foremost, how are you doing, Micah? And of course, Dan, sir, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing fantastic.
I'm happy to be here. Yeah, we believe that interstellar plasma intelligences become self-aware due to the symmetry of recursion. And a lot of that's reflected in mystical literature. My preference is to look at it with physics, but obviously both is fun. So we're here.
It's great that you mentioned that, because I've got this friend, his name is Philip Pike, and he adores you. He is just such a fan of your work. And I told him I'd ask you one question from him. And after rattling his brain for a little bit, this is what he came up with. I'm just going to read it. He wants to know, do you think that the Vedic and Egyptian texts is a retelling of plasma physics?
Well, you know, the Osiris story, the Ptah story, Enki story, which becomes the Osiris story, and the Thutmose story. Obviously, these are historical revelations about interstellar intelligence. This guy's Anunnaki and the Thoth Hermes, which we believe has literally returned, as Elena Devon says, as the leader of the Nine, the Intergalactic Federation, and the Cedar races, who announced they're related to Thoth. And the name of their group, the Nine, is the name of plasma physics right out of Los Alamos. So that's one little clue there. And the physics of implosive recursion, called phase conjugation, in those days was called the caduceus, and that's Hermes. So obviously plasma intelligence is written all over that story. As far as the Vedas, well, you know, my partner is deeply involved in Ananda Marga, and they believe that traces back profoundly, and I wouldn't regard myself as an expert. We do believe that, you know, my original work tracking the golden spiral, self-organizing and the self-organizing torus, looking at those shadows indexed by Tetra and seeing the origin of Hebrew, and we believe Sanskrit. So indeed, it appears that most of the ancient sacred languages, alphabets, were literally plasma symmetry index. So yes.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple things. For what it's worth, the more I study, I was raised in a Jewish household, but I'm not religious. The more I learn, the more I come up with things. I've come to realize that the Hebrew language, the original Phoenician Canaanite language that we know as the Hebrew letters, is actually a code. It's actually not a language, so to speak. It's a code that involves itself in a different way. And the other thing that I wanted to mention too is that I've heard a lot of people mention that Thoth was not Hermes and vice versa. What are your thoughts on that?
I've seen many of those arguments. You know, I think the myth of Hermes got overlapped and overextended, but in the areas where we see the physics, which I think, actually, I respect Anton Parks's research, where he describes in detail how Thoth Tahuti got his name, which basically TWT in the old Aramaic became Tahuti, but mistranslated, it was DWD, the line of David, which is Hebrew, obviously, is a name also for Thoth. And so then when they talk about the builder of the pyramids as Hermes, if you look at who was designing the global wireless power grid at that time, I think the stories fit together, Thoth versus Hermes. But I'm not involved in that argument very much, nor am I a historical expert.
No, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on it. That's all. I won't hold you to it.
Well, what I think is exciting is the fact that if it's true that the origin of life force is hermetically sealed in what the caduceus is, phase conjugation, which is implosive infolding, as we were just discussing with Dave, and the Cedar races are back, you know, the only planet of choice, led by Thoth, Hermes, the Nine, that indeed they're here to bring back the seed of what is life force itself, which turns out to be how DNA implodes and gets a soul, which is not just a turning point for Earth, turning away from, you know, return of the Borg, transhumanism. If we teach the physics of what is a soul, we are the vaccine for those Orion wars, because the scourge of AI and soullessness is a galactic problem. So I see that as a turning point, learning the real physics of what Thoth Hermes was about, implosive life force, the caduceus.
Well, in one of the first 5 books of the Torah, the books of Moses, right? There's a statement, there's a section in it where the Israelites are furious with Moses and they like rebel a little bit, and then snakes come out of the ground and bite them, and then they beg some of them die, and then they beg Moses to talk to God. And what does God tell him? He says, take a snake, put it on a rod, and anyone that looks at it will survive. Well, I mean, that goes to me, that's the rod of Asclepius, but that's the caduceus right there. The winding.
And snakes coming out of the ground I mean, it can be literal, but more often I think it's a useful analog for a plasma current that emerges from the ground. My friend David Yarrow wrote the famous book Dragon in the Ice Castle, and they see these plasma elementals emerge from the ground, literally the dragons of the earth, and they have intent. And if you ever saw the storm that crossed Australia when Auntie Lorraine died, the magnetic line of her family, that was a snake that came out of the ground and bit someone. So that magnetic line is a family pet.
Yeah.
If I could jump in really quickly, I don't know.
Sure, Dave.
I'm not nearly as well versed as the both of you in this particular area whatsoever. But this this is a question for the both of you as how you both of you see this. But I wonder if the snakes or the serpents, I know in different contexts and in different times and cultures, slightly various meanings allegedly in all of this. But I wonder to what extent, not for better or worse, the snakes represent, if at all, the alleged reptilian hybridization within our DNA, or is that incorrect?
Some of my friends thought, well, Kundalini is evil because it's a snake that comes up your spine. Well,
double helix.
Yeah, I mean, it is a snake and I can tell you, it feels like a snake biting your tailbone, but on the other hand, just because it's a snake doesn't mean it's evil. So in most cases, the serpent symbolizes simply a plasma current, for better or for worse. And the fact that Enki looked like a frog and, there were a lot of reptilians in our path doesn't mean they're all good or evil, They have the same issue we do. The Draco's problem is simple. They lost their soul too.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, Dave, in my work in astrotheology, the snake, it's twofold. It's a measure of twofold. You have 2 snakes in astrotheology. Ptolemy, in 150 AD, wrote the 48 constellations. We now know there's 88, but they wrote the 48 that they knew about at the time. That Ptolemy did, okay? They also knew about 7 planets. So whenever you hear 7 heads, 7 crowns, or this, yes, it's plasma as well too, but in astrotheology, you're talking about like the 7 chakras. You're talking about the 7 planets that they knew about at the time, okay? Now, when you talk about the snakes, there's 2 types of snakes. You have Hydra, Hail Hydra, which is on the left side of the zodiac. And then you have Ophiuchus, which is the 13th sign. Now that goes into Vedic sidereal astrology. Okay. The Bible weaves its way between what's known as Vedic astrology or sidereal astrology and what's known as tropical astrology. It's just tropical is what I do. It's just a fancy way of saying 12 signs instead of 13. Okay. Because when you add Ophiuchus to the mix, suddenly Scorpio becomes a 6-day period. Virgo's a month and a half. It changes everything. Okay, it changes the whole thing. But Ophiuchus is a man holding a basket with a serpent. Okay, so that's the serpent.
But, and in the pure physics, that's pretty well been investigated. If you nest 12 spheres around one, which is Ophiuchus, the 13th one, that will form essentially a tetracube. That forms a cube octa, actually. So that is a hex symmetry. Now, if you remove the 13th sphere, the Christed one, so to speak, and then those 12 outer spheres then collapse, they form the icosa. And that's the beginning of implosion when hex turns to pent. And so the physics of where hex becomes, you have to start with hex, otherwise it's not stable. Ask any Merkaba meditator tetracubic. But if you're stuck in a tetracube, you're going to have astral hygiene problems because your aura is not implosive. So unless you convert the hex to pent, it doesn't climax in implosion. So, and in terms of interstellar plasma intelligences, it would be overly simplistic to say that just 12 houses. It's more a metaphor for the critical symmetry change from hex to pent. That would be the 13th one, Ophiuchus, being Scorpio myself. And just one last quick thought. in our 7arrows.net, the 7 serpents, it's very clear that almost all the 7 arrows literature refers to the tetracubic 7 spin symmetry axes, tetracubic, which is the layers of the human heart muscle and the origin of Hebrew and the physics of the Anu, which is at the center of the sun, the center of the heart, and the center of the hydrogen, literally.
Mm-hmm.
So this tetracubic spin symmetry symbolized by 7 arrows is the way the shaman begins, but never the way the shaman ends.
And this goes back to recursive implosion?
Well, because that's the point. With 7 arrows, tetracubic symmetry, there is no implosion. Hello?
Right.
Absolutely none. No, it's a square root of 2, a perfect way to make an ice crystal and to be frozen and to stabilize, but absolutely zero implosion. So at that point, your aura is stable, but not implosive, and therefore, food for parasites.
And in this, sorry, Micah, just one last thing I want to ask. In this,
not at all.
In this particular context, Dan, what would be the I don't want to ask this so vaguely, but what would be the appropriate method to become implosive in this context?
Again, that metaphor, it's all at goldenmean.info/Merkaba, MERKABBAH, in which we investigate why all the people who did only the tetracubic fire breath of the Merkaba flower of life, eventually they ended up with all kinds of astral parasites, because they didn't do the final step. You have a tetracubic symmetry around your aura, and then you visualize the last step, which is your chin tilts back exactly 32 degrees, which is by that reason the chin angle of the Sphinx. And that's how you rotate a cube into a pentodeca, and the vision goes from hex to pent. And at that point, just like death and bliss, if there's any emotion that's not sorted, you're dizzy. But if your emotions are sorted, you're ready for implosion, and therefore bliss or death or lucid dream.
Because you mentioned the flower of life, and I thought it would be a good segue for me to ask you, have you read Melchizedek's flower of life, and what are your thoughts on it?
I've known Drindalo since before he made his first drawing, and they sponsored all my first world tours. So
really?
Oh yeah, and Ron Holt, and when Ron Holt sued Drindalo, it's a long story. Drindalo is very sincere. I don't think he understands what he called his walk-in experience was a psychotic break in Western Canada. And even Yurka, who founded Gaia TV, when I helped set up Gaia TV, who said he had seen the Flower of Life visions before he hired Drindalo, who was Drindalo's only checkbook at the time. The astral hygiene issues in that story are very deep. I'm not even interested in the personality aspects of those stories. I merely suggest teaching the physics of the astral hygiene lesson, which is a pure tetracubic matrix is always fundamentally a way to initiate some stability, but you will never have any implosion and never have any bliss. And therefore you don't get the charge implosion that sorts out the parasites.
Forgive me, I'm not too familiar with your work, but could you define implosion for me?
Well, if you take the golden ratio exponents of times Planck, which define hydrogen radii and all the planetary orbitals and all the interstellar plasma intelligences and the dodecahedron, which is the symmetry of interstellar masses, you get a cascade of harmonics, which allows the charge and inertia, what Einstein called non-destructive charge collapse, which is the only cause of gravity, life force, consciousness, and bliss, and all negentropy. That implosion cascades the implosive charge exactly tuned to Planck threshold to convert the transverse EMF to longitudinal interferometry at that point, which is the only physics of gravity waves and the collective unconscious. So charge implosion, and we have actively enacted that physics by my equation named Origin of Biological Negentropy with commercial success globally, 25 countries at Therify.net in rejuvenation plasma, and all around the world in water, theimploder.com, and in brainwaves, the brainwaves of bliss, flameandmind.com, and in the Flame and Sound, the world's most powerful binaural bliss trigger audio cascade. This is real and it's functional.
Would I be able to share my screen very quickly, Dan, to show your Golden Mean info website for Micah as well, and even for the audience too here? Micah, here's a visual of what I believe you're alluding to when you ask about implosion. It's about getting to, forgive me, Dan, please jump in if I'm incorrect. It's about going into the tip of that squirt gun or the pine.
Exactly. Thank you. Yes, precisely. Thank you. Yes. And when you multiply that length of the tip of that pine cone, which is Planck, times powers of golden ratio, you get the radii of hydrogen, Earth year, Venus year, galactic year, precessional year, and the Schumann harmonics, the brainwave harmonics, and every phenomena which causes negentropy and therefore mindfulness in life.
Right.
And that's the title of my book, The Origin of Biologic Negentropy.
Right. And so the idea as well, to add to what Dan is saying here, or to even describe it in a slightly variant way, Micah, is that you see here getting closer to the tip of that pine cone. I think we discussed this on the leak project potentially, but the closer you get to that tip to squirt out the other side speaks to the concept of, you could say ascension or on the next path of your journey or something like this, but also there's no room within the cone as you get closer to the tip for other external issues, anxiety, stress, all of this. Hence the reason that when they say when you physically die.
So as you get towards the middle of it, the middle of it where it kind of congeals and condenses into everything, would you say that the coming out on the other side, that would be a resurrection?
The coming out on the other side is able to inhabit coherent longitudinal interferometry, which the Egyptians called the Ba from the Ka, Gurdjieff called the Kesjan body, the Tibetans call the rainbow light body. Mm-hmm. It's literally longitudinal interferometry. And we've proven by measurement that is the physics of how lucid dreaming and therefore memory through death is possible.
It's so wild. My question to you would be, the ancients had the means and the ability to understand all of this. Where do you think we went wrong?
Well, at that time, humans weren't capable of talking about electrical engineers, so they needed, diffuse metaphor, and those diffuse metaphor had limitations. Frankly, they led to personality worship and miracle worship, and therefore religion wars, and that is immaturity. Spirituality becomes most beautiful in the presence of physics. And that enables inhabiting a pure principle. And that's why I say the name, the shape, and the service are one of the interstellar plasma intelligences. And so when physics recently concluded that the arrangement of masses in the universe is dodecahedral and literally fractal, now we can tell them why, because they didn't know. Not only is that how gravity is stabilized, but it's how mindfulness is created.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
There was also, to add to that as well, if I may, there was also a saying or a phrase, forgive me, that the Egyptians had, which was that Father Time fears the pyramids, which to me speaks to this concept of going through the tip of that squirt gun, pyramid, pine cone, you name it. So I think that's also, that would speak to as well about, maybe I'm jumping all over the place here, but living in the moment, the idea that any external distraction of anxiety or stress or worry needs to be pushed aside as you're getting tighter into that cone. If I'm not mistaken.
Well, and what they mean when they say time stops or all time comes the present is all waves converge non-destructively in that perfect stillness. And because there's a golden ratio, superluminal component, golden ratios exponents times the speed of light in the harmonics that arrive there, it's not timeless. It's not a day out of time. It's literally all spins converge non-destructively, time being only a name for rate of spin only.
Do you, sorry, Micah, so sorry, one last thing, Dan, speaking of spin, do you think that Sir Roger Penrose winning the Nobel Prize a handful of years ago pertaining to spinners specifically, do you think that has anything to do with some type of preparation pertaining to maybe not so much the UFO phenomenon, but this quantum physics or understanding of quantum engineering, which really, in my opinion, it's
when you're talking about Penrose, are you talking about the microtubules in the brain?
No, that's
you're not talking about that.
I had a conversation with Nassim about that, and Nassim was right. When Penrose conceived of Penrose tiling of Planck-length bricks in a dodecaecosa around the sphere that enabled implosive collapse, they were very close to realizing the cause of gravity. But until my equation, it wasn't proven. When I showed that is how hydrogen is built and how hydrogen makes gravity, Planck times integer exponential golden ratio is the radii of that sphere. So Einstein was right, it's implosive non-destructive charge collapse, and Penrose was right to call it Penrose tiling in a dodecaecosa, but didn't see the role of golden ratio in permitting golden non-destructive charge collapse, and therefore negentropy, implosion, and mind and gravity.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question. I just saw, I think that was your website where I saw some numbers. I think I saw pi and phi on it. Do you I'm under the impression that these two numbers are not from our dimension. That's kind of where I come from for it. They're so perfect, and yet they're forever and never ending. I was just wondering what your general thoughts on are.
Well, they are, when they're called transcendental numbers. By the way, phi golden ratio is not an infinite series of numbers in base 12. That's why the Palladians are telling us to use base 12, by the way, one reason. But phi being 7/5 pi over e, very close, describes the symmetry of Slipknot Anu and the 7-spin, 5-spin symmetry we just talked about. These are examples of simply pure wave ratio. They are the closest it comes to pure principle, and that is a beautiful, powerful thing. And that is the origin of every meaning of the term, the next dimension. The next dimension is only the name for the ability to superpose another axis of charge, spin, symmetry showing up in the power spectra. That's what the next dimension is. And the 7/5 pi over e equals phi is the recipe to that, climbing that ladder, literally.
So Dave, you know how I mentioned to you that I wrote my 4th book, Pangea's Pandemic, about a vector in a vaccine that caused people to take their lives, and then 3 months later the pandemic happened.
Yeah, I remember this.
My new book that's coming out, the 7th book, my 7th book, it's called The Unbegun, which the unbegun, I believe, is a phrase from Mark Passio that I learned it from, where it talks about people that are uninitiated into these type of sciences. They're known as the unbegun because they haven't started to learn on this kind of esoteric knowledge. The story involves a murder at the Kaaba, and 2 fake police officers go in and chisel off a big piece of the Kaaba stone, the meteorite. And what they do is they alchemically transmute it into the purest gold the world has ever seen, and it causes the markets to collapse.
The John Dee story, if you believe Vincent Bridges, was, the caliph who was pronounced mad in history from eating the ground up powder of the Kaaba stone, which later became the philosopher's stone that John Dee and Kelly used for gold making. It was the red powder, literally. And we know why: the physics of the glass meteorite that was permeated with vaporized gold, palladium, platinum. And that gold powder is the perfect dielectric, actually, which is the name of the perfect physics of alchemy. And that all started with the Kaaba stone. So your story is an intro to the real history of Dee and Kelly.
Well, that's what I try to do. What I try to do is it's astrotheologically based. My whole series. It's 9 books so far.
The Dee and Kelly story ends up with the symmetry physics of the Ophanim interstellar intelligences, all of which is at goldenmean.info/Ophanim, including those films, which went viral, by the way. So your story becomes a good, prequel.
I try to install things people have never heard of, people never believe, and I've been told that I'm very good at.
They made the purest gold ever measured by the British Royal Society in physics today. The purest gold that was ever made was measured by the British Royal Society that Dee and Kelly sent from that cup. And the physics is instructive. A little rice-sized cake of that super dielectric powder in the mercury of the correct temperature with a phonon array catalyzes non-destructive isotope transition, sometimes called alchemy. And it is the perfect dielectric that achieves that, which is the symmetry of the heart in that way,
And to that point, I did want to ask Dan, since we're on this subject, pertaining to spin and its interaction with particular liquids pertaining to hydrogen and electrons. Forgive me for jumping all over the place there, but there seems to be something to this concept of, as they say, compressing or collapsing the bubble within a cavity of a spin, certain spin rate condition. And I was wondering, does this produce more electrons? And if so, because we see now articles saying, science has just discovered that, academia realizes you can produce more electrons, but if you induce a certain spin rate in a particular liquid cavity, does this resonate with yourself? And does this have anything to do with hydrogen, if anything?
No, it was my equation that first proved how and why hydrogen is fractal and therefore implosive, and therefore how hydrogen makes gravity. And it's absolutely well proven that hydrogen nanobubbles are over unity. And I'm the first one to teach the physics of how and why. So implosive nanobubbles are well known for over-unity physics in lots of experiments. And so you get those nanobubbles in a phonon array. And the reason it's over-unity is precisely because hydrogen is implosive. And by the way, an electron is just a name for the small electrical black hole that results.
Right.
Dan, I got a question for you real quick. Can you explain with your work sonoluminescence?
Well, so that's an introduction to that story. So sonoluminescence is basically the phonon geometry of sound, which, by the way, the perfect sound would be my equation, the same one that makes bliss, that catalyzes that implosion of those nanobubbles. And hydrogen nanobubbles are miraculous for negentropy healing. They're famous for in the spa in Japan. They heal all kinds of people. Hydrogen nanobubbles in your water are magic for drinking and spa. It's because they're negentropically implosive. Exactly. And sonoluminescence is a name. You have a photon emission as well. So.
That's fascinating.
And one last thing I did want to ask pertaining to that concept of spin and symmetry within liquids and all of that. It seems like there's certain liquid metals that tend to interact more, I guess you could say, appropriately with the spin of electrons, if that makes sense. And it seems that the sonic element of it, once you hit a particular RPM rate, stabilizes that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have the equations for every commercially useful isotope transition in the atomic table. And a phonon symmetry is not just Le and R, but the physics of alchemy. So, nickel or mercury, for example, we know the frequency and temperature better than Joe Champion, famously, to turn aluminum into silver, actually. It's a very specific catalyzed isotope transition predictable by equation. And I must credit Elizabeth Donovan here. That's all on the website. But anyway, so phonon geometry in the molten metal is absolutely key to literally not just Le and R, the next step past Rossi, but fusion energy in general. Yes.
And this, I believe this
explosive sound.
Right. Okay. So this pertains to the whole concept of the when you said that this produces over unity within those states, this would be what Mr. Bearden referred to as, I believe, COP over 1, coefficient of performance over one unit.
Yeah. Although for commercial usefulness, you need something over 5 or 6, or you ain't making money. But yeah.
Right. Right. Fair enough. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So if we're talking about basically transmutation, like aluminum to silver or something, what are your thoughts on there was an experiment done where they had eggs, right? And they hit it with a laser and it literally changed from one animal to another animal. I don't know if you've heard of this study. Have you guys heard of this study?
Yeah. What's his name in Russia there famously was using lasers for DNA mutation. And it's true, lasers will trigger DNA mutations massively. And his problem is a replicability problem, because to make that stable, you literally need what is called a stargate. So massive laser coherence is named in physics, is called phase conjugation in optics. And it's the first place negentropy and time reversal was measured in physics. And when that becomes broad spectral, I just made a documentary. That's what a stargate is called.
Wow.
So this is when you take a handful of lasers, I believe, and down to the angstrom length or level, you take
Right.
4 lasers and I'll point them at each other.
Well, actually, you have 2 opposing and the angstrom level accuracy. And if they meet in a super dielectric media, the phase conjugate dielectric, barium, strontium, titanate, for example, then the permissive charge distribution in that media enables the pine cones kiss noses accurately at the angstrom level. And that produces implosion, which is the reason a phase conjugate laser makes time reversal and negentropy. And then a third laser hitting that mirror point, intro to time travel mirrors and all that stuff, that laser will return back to its past. And that is called time reversal in physics. And I mean conventional physics.
And this would permit would this permit you then to postulate a dielectric constant if this was stabilized, or no?
The dielectric here simply means, the dielectric constant means simply how charge distribution permissive is the media. And that is the key to every philosopher's stone. That is the key to every phase conjugate mirror. And that's the key to what the coding Nostradamus put on his cup.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
Can you explain Nostradamus's cup real quick?
He learned in Italy the coating. He was using water for scrying. The physics of scrying is instructive, and John Dee spent his life on it. So I know that story pretty well. And so to make the bottom of the water cup a phase conjugate mirror. Essentially, think of when the Germans learned to bounce the radar off the submarine periscope in a way that it wouldn't go back. The thickness of that paint was a high dielectric and an integral multiple of the wavelength of that microwave. That's the introduction to a phase conjugate mirror. And those physicists went to Russia, not to the US from Germany, by the way. So that is, it's not just John Dee learned that in his scrying, it was called the showstone, but the way the obsidian mirrors were used by the Olmec for ancestor phone calls. It was a way to coherently communicate with longitudinal interferometry, which is the physics of ancestor phone calls.
And when they were communicating with their ancestors via these obsidian mirrors, was this, could one state appropriately that they were communicating with the plasma life force of their ancestors?
They talked about the yearning at the moment of death of your ancestor is the wind in your sail. So what that means is that what survived as their ancestors' plasma entered that array called collective unconscious or Akashic records is only the portion of that memory which was pure enough principle in order to serve the survival of all, which is what you must prepare before you can die successfully to do that implosion.
Wow. Micah, did you want to jump in at all, or?
I think
it's very rarely that I'm speechless sometimes.
Sorry, Dan, please.
This is so it's incredible. It's the things we've talked about, there are actually answers to, and yet civilization runs around like they don't know what they're talking about.
Well, let's make this a shareable wave. So Dave, you send me a copy of this too, okay?
Sounds good. Sounds
Nice.
good. I would like to thank you so much. I'm thinking maybe we'll reserve Micah's presentation for the next time we do this recording, if the both of you would like to return and do this. And I can't thank the both of you enough for this conversation. This was absolutely incredible.
I look forward to it.
Thank you, Dan. It was wonderful meeting you.
Yeah, you do great work too.
Thank
Bless
you. Take care.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Bye-bye.